afternoon, all of you who are out in virtual land. I know we're not live, but we welcome you to our Wednesday conversation, the first of many that deal with mental health and suicide prevention. I'm joined by two phenomenal members here at the Macedonia community, Deacon Greg Owens and Dr. Janice Pride Boone. Both of them have been absolutely instrumental in the work and progression that we've made as a church community, focusing on issues that are beyond just the spiritual realm, but focusing on issues that impact us holistically. Of course, as a church, we focus on Jesus Christ and Him crucified, but Jesus Christ also commands us to love one another. And how we love one another is absolutely critical. It's critical because we are given the tools necessary to impact the livelihood and success opportunities for those in whom we serve. And so we'll be having this conversation on mental health today, specifically since September is National Suicide Prevention Month. I'm joined by these two wonderful individuals, and I'm gonna ask if they would introduce themselves in their own way.
Greetings, I'm Dr. Pride Boone. I'm a board certified pediatrician with additional training in marriage and family therapy. I've traveled all over the country. I've practiced on all the regions of the United States. I've been practicing for over 40 years. I'm happy to be at Macedonia. I'm part of the health ministry. I'm affectionately called the Chief Medical Officer. I'm also a member of the Grief and Bereavement Ministry. I'm happy to serve today. We have a critical problem in our community. As you may well know, we are dealing with suicide in our youth. Our numbers of suicide, unfortunately, have doubled in children from age 5 to 12. So this is a critical mission for me. Our teens, unfortunately, have also seen an increasing rate in suicide. We, for years, have thought our children have been immune from this problem, but we are not. And so we are here today to address that.
Greetings. I'm Greg Owens, and I'm a deacon here at Macedonia Baptist Church, a proud deacon at Macedonia Baptist Church. I'm also a licensed master social worker with over 40 degrees in the field. I retired from state government after 35 years of working for the state. And it's a pleasure to be able to be here today to talk about this important issue. Most of my career has focused on young people dealing with issues of equity, racism, how these cultural phenomena impact the outcomes for our children, youth, and families. And I think that this is a conversation that we need to have because, as you heard Dr. Pride Boone say, the rates of suicide and attempted suicide within our community, particularly among our young people, have been going up for some time now. And it's a conversation that we have not yet had that we need to talk about. So I'm hopeful that we can do that here today. I've done this work around the country and currently am involved with stakeholders in New Jersey and in North Carolina, but I'm real glad to be home and having this conversation to talk about how the church can better impact this for our children, youth, and families. So it's good to be here today.
So again, thank you both for coming out on a Saturday morning, driving in from vacation and driving from around the corner just to be here to have this really important conversation. And specifically, you two, I asked because I know you have an extensive history as it relates to working with others to better themselves in the field of science, in the field of social welfare, specifically having a conversation around mental health. And so one of the things as a church community, not just Macedonia, but the church as a whole, is we have to be better at having these hard conversations that we never talk about. Just because we don't talk about them, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so again, thank you so much. I do want to start off with some statistics from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They state that 21% of U.S. adults experienced mental illness in the year of 2020. That's 52.9 million people, or the representation of 1 in 5 adults. 5.6% of U.S. adults experienced serious mental illness in 2020. That was the equivalent of 14.2 million people. Clearly, mental health illnesses impact a much larger portion of our population, significantly more than we talk about or that society or media lets on. Why do you think it is that it is not talked about as frequently as it should, not just in our church, but in a society as a whole, when so many Americans and people are suffering from mental health illnesses? Dr. Boone, I'll start with you.
I think part of our American culture has been this John Wayne ruggedness, particularly with men, maybe so more so than women. And to admit that I may be not feeling well in general, even physical illness. For a man to say, I hurt, I'm sick, it's difficult. And so, as an American culture, to be able to admit, I don't feel good is difficult. And mental illness is difficult to put a face on. So, there's a lot of shame around not being well. And when you can't physically see it, it's more so. And then if you move to the church environment, where there's been this demonic piece, mental illness has a demonic sort of milieu piece to it, that maybe, are you possessed? Are you weak? Did you do something wrong in your past life? Was there a sin? So it is difficult to talk about mental illness because illness itself may have a connotation of sin,
Right.
of weakness. So men particularly, but the general population has trouble being sick. Women generally go to the doctor. Men particularly have trouble going to the doctor. So being ill is tough. Being mentally ill is even tougher. So only now in COVID, I think COVID has been tough for the nation, but COVID at least has allowed us to talk about what happens when you're sick. And mental illness has been so bad. The pandemic has brought out so much illness that now at least mental illness has got a spotlight on it. And we're able to talk about there's physical and mental illness, and we can at least begin to address the fact that all of the body can be sick, and above the neck and below the neck is also part of being sick.
Thank you.
But illness is just a tough
I
subject.
certainly echo what Dr. Pride Boone has said. I think it's very much a cultural issue for us as an American culture, for all the reasons that Dr. Pride Boone said. This notion of being strong, of being able to overcome, don't need a whole lot of help from other people because you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Has gotten us away from truth telling and storytelling. And if you're going to deal with these issues, you got to be able to tell your story about it. I think when you talk about notions of culture and you talk about how it's racialized, certainly black folks have been depicted as being crazy just for trying to escape enslavement, right? And so there was a term for it. And so when you add that to the conversation, you find that we are having difficulty because of the history of how we've been portrayed and the history of what we've accepted about the history of how we've been portrayed. And so we just don't talk about it. There are family secrets. They get passed on by generation. And then as Dr. Pride Boone said, within the context of our faith walk, this notion of not having prayed enough or having sinned or just pray your way through it continues to be a dominant theme. If you're not careful, it keeps you from getting the kind of help that you need. So being able to talk about this out loud in the context of your entire journey, including your faith journey, is really critically important.
So to further go in and really appreciate that mindset, and I do realize that it's a very weighty question, right? That there are so many factors that influence why mental health is talked about in certain contexts and why it is not talked about in certain contexts. And even within the certain context that it is talked about, what factors dictate whether a person is suffering from mental illness or not, right? What have they experienced in their lifetime through their journey? What has society set them up to experience that now is causing some of these mental health issues, illnesses? So again, the National Alliance on Mental Illness state that there are not just 1 in 5 U.S. adults who are dealing and battling mental illness, but they give further breakdown from a demographic standpoint and from what individuals are experiencing. So they say that 22.6% of non-Hispanic white individuals are battling mental illness. Non-Hispanic Black and African American is 17.3%. Non-Hispanic mixed and multiracial is 35.8%, and then Hispanic or Latino is 18.4%, which in fact seems to offer disproportionate numbers in comparison to our total societal numbers, right? When I focus in, and we focus in on that 17.3% of African Americans who are dealing with mental health illnesses, what do you think has impacted or contributed to the Black community having such a disproportionate number of us who are battling mental illness within our context? Deacon Owens?
I think it's about structural racism first and foremost. I think it's about the next level, which is institutionalized racism. So how do our institutions impact that circumstance for us? And then I think it's about how we in the Black community have viewed each other in terms of whether or not we're healthy or not healthy, and what does not being healthy look like, and oh, I don't want to have that happen to me, so I shy away from that. I don't talk about that. So I think there's some cultural phenomenon that's within our community that we have to begin to talk about. But I do believe the bigger issue for us has always been historically in this country, the structuralized way that we have not been allowed either access to help and care, and therefore access to being healthy and well-being. And that has never really gone away. And so when you take a look at places where there's high levels of poverty, where you have people who are people of color, and then further, kind of disaggregating it into Black communities, you've got access as an issue. And when there's access, you've got treatment as an issue. And so are people in the profession treating Black folks the way that they treat others becomes an issue of discrimination. It results in disparate outcomes. And so when you look at our representation in the population, and then you look at our overrepresentation in terms of almost any circumstance, including this mental health and mental illness phenomenon, I think it begins with that big issue of how structural racism has impacted us over the course of time. It has not gone away. And then I think we also need to pursue our own health at the individual level by being able to break through some of the stereotypes and stigma that we have accepted. And that's why these conversations are important. We got to get new language and a new view of one another in order to really talk about this within our community. Right, Dr. Boone?
Yes, I agree. Access is huge. In fact, the Biden administration just passed a new ruling that the schools can now use Medicaid dollars to hire mental health workers for the public schools because access has been so poor. So many children that I see, I have to really push on an individual level to get them help because we have so few psychiatrists, mental health workers for children so often. And then when I finally get them help, they come in with 15 diagnoses, which cannot be possible. The child cannot have schizophrenia, bipolar, and ADHD. This is impossible. So trying to get the child to a good psychiatrist or a good mental health worker is very difficult, if you can get one at all. So we don't have a good supply of mental health workers, and then trying to access the system in general, and then getting them a good person to take care of is taxing. So it's great that the Biden administration has now provided a way we can at least try to get children access through the school system. But trying to get our children, whereas a wealthy child, a Caucasian child in a wealthy neighborhood can see a psychiatrist and get a diagnosis and get treatment. Our children will suffer needlessly and wind up in a prison system, but they should have wound up with a mental health worker. Right. So our children suffer because of lack of access and misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis or over-medication because they don't have access to quality and adequate care.
Right. As a continuation of that same question, so I know representation is huge, right? I know that when Amber and I had our children, we specifically looked for a Black pediatrician. I didn't know Dr. Boone at the time, or you would have been their doctor. And we found one, but finding a Black pediatrician was like finding a needle in a haystack, right? It was very, very difficult. And once we did find one, we found that a lot of the circles that we were operating in used and had the same pediatrician. That pediatrician retired, and we had to search high and low for another one. The same thing as relates to Black males, or people of color in the field of social welfare, right? Trying to find a individual who looks like me, who thinks like me, who comes from my context, to be able to speak to some of these issues was very difficult. And luckily we have a Deacon Gregory Owens, but Deacon Gregory Owens is not duplicated across the country. He goes across the country, but there are not many of him there. Can you speak to how important it is to have that representative in that profession who can speak to some of these mental illnesses that our communities are dealing with, and how much further along we can be if we have more individuals like yourself who go into these professions who can speak to these issues? Dr. Boone, I'll start with you.
I mean, there are just voluminous studies that prove the unconscious bias in white medical students or medical students who are not BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So they unfortunately bring their biases into the exam rooms, and so we are either overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And so it's very important. And so there are lots of efforts to try to get more minority students from high school to come into professional schools.
There's a plane going by, so we're gonna let the plane fly over. It could be President Barack Obama for we know, so we're just gonna let the plane go over.
Maybe he can
let him-
land and come to service tomorrow. Come on down.
Well, please continue.
So we need more of us, and I encourage our students, and I work hard to recruit every child that I know to try to get them when I see them in the office. What are you going to be when you grow up? So I try to get everybody to go into a profession, a helping profession that will help us ultimately, because we know our lived experience, and so
Right.
we don't bring, generally speaking, we don't bring our biases into that exam when we're there to help and to serve.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, people can bring their biases. Now the medical schools are trying, and I speak as a provider, trying to help people recognize their biases so they don't, for instance, pain and sickle cell anemia, undertreatment, terribly undertreated, so that people recognize their biases, try to do better. But study after study show we don't get the appropriate medications. We don't follow the algorithms that are built into the computer systems so that you make the same diagnosis, you do the same treatment regardless of race and income. But even if we're well educated, well insured, same money, we may not get the same adequate treatment. And so those biases are there. It's very important that we try to get as many providers who look like the people they serve, because the biases are just there and they're hidden. We have to deal with them. We try to teach each other. The studies have just proven time and time again that we need more of us to enter the helping field. So Greg and I do our best, but we try to duplicate by teaching, by getting children to come to Macedonia, but go to church, because studies after studies show going to church, and we'll get to this, I'm sure you will, protects our children against mental health disease. They're just beautiful stuff. I went to Harvard. I trained with George Vincent, who's the father of meditation and prayer, and the importance of that in healthy mental health, and teaching our children the value of prayer, centering prayer as protection against mental health disease is invaluable. So what we do in our churches are very important. So and Greg will speak to the program that will come.
Yeah, no, and for those that don't know, I'm finishing my MSW degree this December. I'm following in some good footsteps here, my second master's. But for many, Deacon Greg Owens has been a pioneer and a trailblazer in the field of social welfare. But I don't see too many of me and you that are in that space. What impact does that have as we have these conversations where there's a lack thereof of Black males or Black women in this space? What impact does that have on us as a society?
I think it makes us, experience higher risk for the kinds of dire outcomes that we are experiencing. It puts us in a place where we have to rely upon a system that was not designed to really meet our needs the same way that it meets the needs of other people. And so you still have this notion of racialized outcomes because the treatment is impacted by the biases that Dr. Pride-Bloom talked about. It's impacted by our anxiety about going to the system to get help because of mistreatment sometimes when we go. And so I think when you have an opportunity to see someone who looks like you at least have an opportunity to seek a conversation that can put you in a place where you can take in information differently. It's not caught up with being afraid and the amygdala gets hijacked and you can't really hear because you're worried about how you're going to be treated, how you're going to be seen. You got another airplane coming through. I think this is a plan. I think every time we get to the serious thing,
a plane comes over.
Yeah.
We gotta check the plane algorithm, the schedule, and like
this conspiracy thing going on.
I've never heard this many planes come over on a Saturday.
You start talking about mental health, folks, boy.
We getting there.
But I do think, for example, speaking in my high voice, I had the blessing of having a father who was a dentist, a brother who was a dentist. My brother took after my father, took his following in his shoes and actually taking over his practice. There were folks who didn't even know there was such a thing as a Black dentist back in the day. So they would come and just stare in my father's office window just to see if that was real. I'm talking about Black folks, white folks, all all kinds of people would come by, and then he was able to overcome whatever they were thinking about that, the stereotypes, the assumptions about that. He had a wonderful practice. You got to get beyond that first. And then my work with the social work profession, I was part of the National Association of Black Social Workers for many years. And there's a paucity of males today that we experienced back in the 1970s when I first entered the profession. And I think part of that is because we don't think we're going to make a lot of money.
So if we continue that conversation, and we know that there are close to 50 million Americans who are living with currently at this moment. Well, the data was from 2020, but we know 2020 also gave us a pandemic that also exacerbated a lot of issues and concerns within people, especially our Black and brown communities. And so we can assume that 50 million people, that number has grown. But from 2020, they said that they gave a breakdown of the types of illnesses that people deal with, right? So 21 million people have had a major depressive episode. 1.5 million people deal with schizophrenia, 7 million bipolar disorder, an estimated 48 million anxiety disorders, 9 million PTSD, 3 million OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, 3.5 million borderline personality disorder. And so we know that there are a lot of people who we interact with every day who we probably have no idea really deal with mental health concerns and have mental health issues. What's the most common thing you hear from people who are living with mental health illnesses that they want others to know? You know, if you're having a conversation with someone in your doctor's office and they're diagnosed or they've been dealing with an illness for some time, what's the most common thing you think that they would want those around them who are interacting with them every day to know about them?
I think one of the most important things that we can do, and for people who are dealing with mental health and what they want us to hear, is the degree of suffering. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is dealing with the suffering that we're hearing in their experience, is the anterior cingulate cortex. It's the frontal lobe, but it's the part just before. And interesting enough, the physical suffering, if I get cut or I'm in a car accident and I'm experiencing depression, that same part of the brain is activated. So the body can't tell depression from I just lost my arm. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts.
Right.
And what we don't want them to do is make a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And that's what suicide is. They are in such pain. And when I see a young person who wants to die, I have to hold on to that patient. I have to not let them out of my sight, because they can literally kill themselves. And if I step out of the office, I have to ring a bell, make sure I have a nurse in it right there, because they can try. That's the same thing with prison. They take their shoelaces, their belts, because they'll take a permanent solution to a temporary problem. They are in such agony and pain. They want to die because they want the pain to stop. They just want the pain to stop. They feel as if they just lost their arm. And so they are suffering and their pain is real. And you probably know there was a deacon who killed himself in the Alfred Church in DC. We know people who are in church who are suffering, who are hurting.
Join us next week, Wednesday, September 28th, as we continue the conversation on mental health.